February 21, 1980. The University of South Alabama lay quiet under a winter sky, its walkways scattered with a few late-night students hurrying back to their dorms. Among them was an 18-year-old freshman named Katherine Foster, bright, disciplined, deeply admired by friends and professors alike. She was the kind of young woman who always kept her commitments, never missed class, never left without telling someone where she was going. But that night, she didn't come back. The following day, searchers found her in a patch of grass just off the main campus, a place she would have walked countless times. At first glance, she could have been sleeping. Her hair was neatly combed, makeup still in place, clothes untouched. But two small entry wounds told the truth. A .22 caliber bullet had entered the back of her head, another through her temple. There were no signs of a struggle. No sign she had tried to run. Whoever had pulled the trigger was someone she had trusted enough to stand still for. In those first days, investigators worked through the night, but the trail was thin. There was no weapon. No eyewitness. No obvious motive. The case grew cold, leaving Katherine's family to carry the unbearable weight of unanswered questions. For years, her name would appear in faded clippings and cold case lists, a bright young life cut short, her killer living somewhere out there, unseen. And then, nearly 30 years later, a single slip broke the silence. A confession, shared in a moment of supposed safety, found its way to the police. It came not from a stranger, not from an old suspect, but from a woman Katherine had once called a friend. A woman who had walked the same campus, attended the same meetings, and, for decades, carried the memory of what she had done. This is the story of Katherine Foster, and the friend who masked a killer for nearly 3 decades. It was February of 1980 in Mobile, Alabama. The air carried a damp chill from the nearby Gulf, and a faint mist hung over the sprawling campus of the University of South Alabama. The tall oaks along the walkways swayed gently, their bare winter branches scraping softly against the lamplight. The dormitories were mostly quiet, doors shut, radios muffled behind cinderblock walls, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. In this stillness moved Katherine Foster. She had graduated the previous year from Davidson High School, not just as a senior but as a standout, salutatorian of her class, an honor earned by her relentless focus and discipline. She was the sort of student whose teachers remembered years later, bright, methodical, and quietly determined. Those who knew her at the university described her as mature beyond her years, someone who took her coursework seriously and carried herself with a sense of purpose. That Thursday evening, Katherine had been in her dorm room with friends. 2 of them, Tish and Jamie, had decided to leave for a short trip to a store nearby. Katherine stayed behind, saying she would wait for them. The decision seemed small, insignificant. But in the hours that followed, it would become the last known choice she made. Across campus, most students were either in class or tucked into their rooms. A few walked briskly between buildings, shoulders hunched against the cold, their footsteps echoing in the open spaces between lecture halls. No one noticed Katherine as she made her way toward the edges of the campus. No one saw the moment she crossed from the glow of the streetlights into the dim shadows that lined the wooded stretch near the maintenance area. And no one could have imagined what waited there. Her life, up to that night, had been moving forward with the momentum of someone who had plans, real plans, for her future. Friends say she wanted to work in a profession where she could help others. She had a small, close-knit circle and trusted them deeply. It was the kind of trust you give only when you've known someone for years, the kind of trust that would prove deadly. That Thursday evening began like so many others on the University of South Alabama campus. Katherine Foster had been in her dorm room with 2 friends, Tish and Jamie. The 3 had been talking casually, passing the time. At some point, Tish and Jamie decided to leave for a quick trip to the store. Katherine told them she would stay behind. She wasn't in a rush to go anywhere, she had classes the next morning, and perhaps a little studying left to do. When her friends returned later, Katherine was gone. At first, there was no alarm. She was known to walk around campus, sometimes visiting familiar spots to think or simply get fresh air. But as the hours passed and she didn't come back, a quiet concern began to grow. By the next day, February 22, 1980, the search began. The campus, usually alive with the chatter of students and the movement of faculty, carried a different energy, uneasy, restrained. Word spread quickly that a missing person report had been filed. Several hours into the search, in a patch of grass not far from the edge of the campus, a figure was spotted. It was Katherine. She was lying on her back, her eyes closed, as if resting. Her hair was neatly in place. Her makeup remained untouched. Her clothes showed no rips, no dirt, no signs of a struggle. But when investigators looked closer, they saw what the casual eye could not: two small, devastating wounds. One bullet had entered the back of her skull. Another had been fired into her temple. The weapon, a .22 caliber, was nowhere to be found. The autopsy would confirm what those first observations suggested. The shots had been fired at close range. There were no defensive wounds, no bruising or abrasions on her hands or arms, no evidence that she had fought back. This detail would haunt investigators. If there had been no struggle, then she must have known the person standing in front of her. She must have felt no reason to run. Police began the difficult task of retracing her steps. Witnesses placed her walking alone across the campus the previous night, moving toward the less traveled areas beyond the main student paths. No one reported hearing gunshots, though the small caliber weapon might have been quiet enough to pass unnoticed, blending into the sounds of the evening air. As investigators surveyed the scene, one thing became immediately clear: this was not a random attack by a stranger hiding in the shadows. Everything about the way Katherine's body was found, the absence of chaos, the closeness of the shots, the calm appearance, pointed to something far more unsettling. This was personal. In the words of one officer at the scene, it was as if she trusted the person right up until the moment they pulled the trigger. But who would do this to such a gentle soul? And why? From the beginning, the investigation faced an uphill battle. There was no murder weapon. No fingerprints or footprints that could be linked to a suspect. The small caliber bullets retrieved from Katherine's body were standard .22 rounds, so common that they could have come from any number of handguns in the region. Without a weapon to match them to, they were a clue that led nowhere. Detectives canvassed the university, questioning students, faculty, and staff. Dozens of interviews were conducted, but none revealed a clear lead. No one had heard anything unusual that night, no cries for help, no signs of a confrontation. Some suggested that maybe the killer had silenced the weapon, or that the shots had been fired in such a secluded spot that they went unnoticed entirely. The case files from those early days paint a picture of frustration. There were theories, many theories, but no hard evidence. Police even considered the possibility of a crime of opportunity committed by a passing stranger, but the lack of struggle and Katherine's composed appearance kept drawing them back to a chilling possibility: her killer was likely someone she knew. 3 years later, in 1983, the investigation took a sharp turn. A campus security guard named Michael Maris came to the attention of police. While executing an unrelated search, authorities found his home filled with disturbing material: crime scene photographs, news clippings about Katherine's murder, and other macabre collections. The sheer volume of these items alarmed investigators. They brought Maris in for questioning, probing his whereabouts on the night Katherine was killed. For a time, it seemed as though they might finally have their man. The media whispered about a possible break. The university community, still haunted by Katherine's unsolved murder, watched closely. But as investigators dug deeper, they found that Maris's obsession with the case, however disturbing, was not proof of guilt. His alibi checked out, and there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. With no basis for charges, they were forced to let him go. The disappointment was heavy. Once again, the trail went cold. As the years slipped by, Katherine's parents carried their grief quietly. The hope for justice dimmed with each passing anniversary. Detectives rotated in and out of the mobile police department, and the case file, thick with reports, interviews, and photographs, was moved from one evidence shelf to another. Periodically, a new investigator would take a fresh look, but without a suspect or new evidence, the momentum always stalled. By the late 1990s, the case had become one of those haunting, unsolved tragedies that linger in the background of a community's history. For Katherine's family, every lead that fizzled out felt like losing her all over again. They were left with the same questions they'd had on the day she died. And then, decades later, something happened, something no one could have predicted. A single act, small in the moment, would begin to unravel the silence that had surrounded Katherine's death for nearly 30 years. But when the truth came, it wouldn't come from a stranger, or from a long-forgotten suspect. It would come from the voice of a friend. For more than 2 decades, Katherine Foster's murder remained frozen in time. The case file gathered dust in a cold storage room. And then, a single conversation cracked it open. The tip didn't come from a detective's hunch or a new piece of forensic technology. It came from a quiet corner of a community center, during an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. In AA, members gather in strict confidence, bound by anonymity and mutual trust. But within those walls, one woman spoke words that would ripple far beyond the room. Her name was Jamie Wilson. Jamie had been Katherine's friend and fellow student back in 1980. On the night Katherine was killed, Jamie was one of the last people to see her alive. She and another friend, Tish, had gone out shopping, leaving Katherine behind on campus. When they returned later, Katherine was gone. For decades, Jamie's connection to that night seemed like coincidence. But in the AA meeting, she shared something deeply unsettling. Jamie confided to her sponsor that she had killed someone years earlier. It was part of her process of working through the steps, making a fearless moral inventory, confronting past wrongs, and seeking forgiveness. She didn't say the victim's name outright at first, but as she spoke, details emerged: Mobile, Alabama. A friend from college. A gun. The sponsor listened in shock, realizing that Jamie wasn't describing some nameless stranger, she was describing Katherine Foster. Outside of AA, the sponsor wrestled with a moral dilemma. Confidentiality is a cornerstone of the program. But could she remain silent knowing that a murder had gone unpunished for so long? Eventually, she decided that justice outweighed secrecy. She went to the authorities, and the tip made its way to the Alabama Attorney General's office. When investigators followed up, they discovered something even more extraordinary. Jamie had once written a letter, years earlier, as part of her recovery work. In it, she addressed Katherine directly. She spoke of guilt, of wishing she could undo what she'd done. The letter was never sent, it sat tucked away in her personal belongings, a piece of paper meant only for her own catharsis. But now, that letter became a roadmap for detectives. It was the crack they had been waiting for. The name at the center of Katherine's murder was no longer a mystery, it was someone who had walked beside her, laughed with her, and called herself her friend. Investigators moved carefully. After decades without progress, they couldn't risk spooking Jamie into silence. They began by corroborating the details from the AA sponsor's account. Where had Jamie been that night? Could she have had access to a .22 caliber weapon? Did her life circumstances line up with the fragments in the letter? One by one, the answers fell into place. And yet, this was still a delicate dance. Jamie was older now, more guarded. She had built a life far removed from her college days. But deep down, detectives knew one thing about guilt: it doesn't evaporate with time. It lingers, like a shadow that lengthens as the years stretch on. The moment was approaching. Decades of anonymity, about to be shattered by the simplest of acts, a confession meant for healing, now turned into the key that might unlock justice. Could years of anonymity come crashing down with a simple step toward sobriety? By 2008, Jamie Kellum-Letson had all but vanished from the public eye. She wasn't the smiling college student her classmates remembered. She wasn't even the troubled young woman who once sat in an AA meeting, confessing pieces of her past. She was now a quiet, aging figure in a homeless shelter in Jackson, Mississippi, blending in with the faceless tide of those simply trying to survive another day. To the people around her, she was just Jamie. No one knew that decades earlier she had been at the center of one of Alabama's most haunting cold cases. But the past has a way of finding people, especially when it's armed with a warrant. On a gray morning in April, the shelter's routine was interrupted by the sound of heavy boots on linoleum. Detectives from Alabama, alongside local police, stepped inside with a single purpose. They approached her cot slowly, deliberately. She looked up, startled, perhaps sensing that the day she'd been subconsciously bracing for had finally arrived. "Jamie Kellum-Letson?" one officer asked. A pause. A nod. And then, the handcuffs clicked shut. The arrest sent ripples through those who knew Katherine's story. For her family, it was a jolt, a cocktail of relief, disbelief, and grief so fresh it felt like 1980 all over again. For nearly 30 years, they had carried the weight of unanswered questions, staring into the void of an unsolved murder. Now, there was a name. A face. And it was someone Katherine had once called a friend. Back in Alabama, inside the sterile walls of an interrogation room, Jamie sat hunched, her hands cuffed, her face pale and drawn. Detectives began slowly, recounting fragments of that February night on campus. They didn't push hard at first, they let the silence settle, a tactic that often spoke louder than words. When they mentioned the AA tip and the unsent letter, Jamie's composure faltered. She lowered her gaze, her lips tightening. Minutes stretched into hours, and then, almost without warning, the dam broke. She confessed. In a steady but subdued voice, Jamie described how she had taken a .22 caliber pistol, a small, almost unassuming weapon. She told them about walking across campus to find Katherine. The conversation that started as ordinary turned into something darker. She wouldn't explain why, at least, not in any way that made sense to anyone but her. But she admitted pulling the trigger twice, once in the back of Katherine's head, once at her temple. Her account matched what the autopsy had revealed decades earlier. The lack of defensive wounds. The placement of the shots. Even the detail about Katherine's untouched appearance, the quiet violence of it all. The murder weapon, however, had long since disappeared, swallowed by the years. For the detectives, this was more than a confession, it was a bridge between the fractured shards of an unsolved crime and the truth that had eluded them for almost 3 decades. For Katherine's family, it was something more complicated, an answer that brought no real comfort. They had imagined monsters, strangers, maybe even nameless shadows in the night. Instead, it was someone Katherine had trusted. Someone she'd laughed with. Someone she'd called a friend. The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. When news of the arrest reached Tish, Katherine's friend from that night, she was overcome. In interviews later, she spoke through tears, remembering the 3 of them together just hours before the murder. "If you had told me back then," she said, "I would have sworn on my life it wasn't her." The Foster family prepared for the legal process ahead, knowing that the trial would mean reliving the worst moments of their lives. But in that moment, in that cold, echoing interrogation room, one thing was finally certain: Katherine Foster's killer had spoken her truth out loud. And once the words were out, there was no taking them back. By the time the trial began in 2010, nearly 3 decades had passed since Katherine Foster's life was stolen on the campus of the University of South Alabama. The courtroom was a compressed world, a single room holding 30 years of grief, unanswered questions, and the woman accused of causing them all. Jamie Kellum-Letson entered the courtroom in shackles, wearing a plain jumpsuit, her once bright youth replaced by the weariness of years and the weight of an unspoken past. Across the aisle, Katherine's family sat together, their faces carved in a mix of resolve and pain. For them, this trial wasn't about revenge, it was about giving Katherine the dignity of the truth. Prosecutors wasted no time in painting a portrait of the murder. They recounted the forensic evidence, the trajectory of the bullets, the absence of defensive wounds, the calculated precision of the shots. They read aloud from Jamie's own words, the confession she had given just 2 years earlier. Jurors leaned forward as the details unfolded, the weight of them palpable in the air. The defense had a much harder road to travel. Without the murder weapon, they argued, how could the state truly prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? They suggested the confession could have been influenced by years of guilt, substance abuse, or even mental illness, a mind trying to rewrite its history. They hinted at unexamined suspects, people who had been on campus that night but never investigated deeply. But the forensic corroboration, and Jamie's own detailed admission, loomed too large. Katherine's parents took the stand, their voices trembling but steady. Her mother spoke of Katherine's plans for the future, how she had wanted to become a medical technologist, how she loved to laugh, how she could light up a room without trying. Her father's testimony was quieter, more restrained, but no less piercing. "We lost her once in 1980, he said. "We've been losing her every day since." In the back of the courtroom, college friends from the 1980s sat shoulder to shoulder. Some had flown across the country to be there. They remembered late-night study sessions, shared cafeteria meals, and the gentle warmth that Katherine carried into every friendship. And they remembered Jamie, too, once part of the same circle, now sitting at the defendant's table, her eyes fixed downward. The trial lasted just over a week. When the jury filed back into the room to deliver their verdict, the silence was suffocating. The foreperson stood, unfolded a piece of paper, and read the words that had taken 30 years to reach this moment. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." Gasps and muffled sobs broke the tension. Katherine's mother gripped her husband's hand. Jamie stared ahead, her face unreadable. The judge, in a calm but firm tone, handed down the sentence, life in prison. There would be no possibility of parole. Jamie was escorted away, her orange jumpsuit vanishing through the same door she had entered from, but this time with a finality that even she seemed to understand. A year later, in 2011, Jamie's legal team took the case to the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, hoping to overturn the conviction. They leaned again on the missing murder weapon, arguing that its absence left too much room for doubt. But the appellate court was unmoved. The conviction was upheld in its entirety. Katherine's family, while not celebrating, felt a kind of release, a weary exhale after decades of holding their breath. Still, the absence of the gun remains a small, unhealed wound in the narrative. Without it, no one knows exactly what happened to the weapon, who might have helped dispose of it, or whether it still exists somewhere, rusting quietly in the Alabama earth. For investigators, it's a lingering thread that may never be tied off. For Katherine's family, it's one more reminder that closure is not the same as peace. In the years since the trial, Katherine Foster's story has been told in documentaries, podcasts, and university memorials. Her name is etched into the memories of those who loved her, and her absence is felt in the silence between their laughter. As for Jamie Letson, she remains in prison, a living testament to the truth that time can hide the past, but it cannot erase it. 30 years. That's how long it took for the truth to claw its way to the surface. 30 years of boxes stored in dusty evidence rooms, of files passed from one investigator to another like a puzzle no one could quite finish. And yet, this cold case was not solved by chance, it was solved by persistence. The detectives who inherited Katherine Foster's file didn't see it as an unsolvable relic. They saw it as a debt, owed to Katherine, to her family, to a community that had been robbed of its sense of safety in 1980. They reread old interviews, revisited campus maps, traced timelines in painstaking detail. They knocked on doors that had been closed for decades. In the end, it was not new DNA technology or a sudden discovery of hidden evidence that cracked the case. It was a moment of human frailty, a single slip in the armor of anonymity. Jamie Letson, burdened by years of carrying the truth alone, spoke just a little too much, to just the wrong person. That confession, quiet and unexpected, became the loose thread that, when pulled, unraveled 3 decades of mystery. But it took more than a confession to seal the case. Law enforcement moved carefully, knowing that without the murder weapon, the story could be contested in court. Forensic analysts reviewed every scrap of evidence from the original crime scene, comparing it with Jamie's own account. Detectives in multiple jurisdictions coordinated to confirm her timeline, test her statements, and rule out any possibility of mistaken identity. It was a dance between intuition and proof, between the human instinct to believe a confession and the legal necessity to prove it. In the courtroom, the victory was not loud. There were no cheers when the verdict was read, no triumphant applause. Justice, in this case, felt more like an exhausted sigh, a recognition that while the system had finally worked, it had worked far too slowly for comfort. Looking back, the case of Katherine Foster is a reminder of how justice can be both relentless and fragile. Relentless in the way detectives never closed the file. Fragile in how easily it could have stayed buried if one person had managed to keep their secret just a little longer. Would you ever imagine truth could hide behind sober walls, until regret became an open door? And perhaps that is the haunting part, how many other truths are still hiding in plain sight, locked away in the memories of those too afraid, too guilty, or too proud to speak. Next time, we'll uncover another story where trust was the deadliest weapon. Where a bond built on familiarity became the very thing that sealed a victim's fate. Because in the world of true crime, the people you trust the most, sometimes hide the deepest betrayals.